Okay, so today we are starting with chapter 8, which looks at nature of consciousness. And yeah, if you have any questions throughout today, just put them in the chat box or unmute yourself and just let me know. Okay, so the first spread is called States of Consciousness. Okay, so today what we're going to be doing in this spread is just looking at what consciousness means. We're going to look at how consciousness can change. We're going to look at different states of consciousness. So how a person can go from like doing their work, for example, to falling asleep. Okay, the different states of consciousness that can occur. And we're going to look at the two types of consciousness, which are normal waking consciousness and altered states. And we're going to look at a few examples for those as well. So first things first is the definition of consciousness. So consciousness is our awareness. That's basically what consciousness is. It's our awareness of things in our environment, of objects and events in the external world. So the external world is, in other words, our environment, or, you know, the places around us, where we are, our situations, all that kind of stuff, as well as our internal sensations, thoughts, feelings, and existence, and our awareness of our existence. So internal sensations means, for example, when you're in class, you might be, listening to what I'm saying. You might be writing down what I'm writing on the board. And that's something that's in the external environment. But then at the same time, maybe it's closer to recess and you're feeling really hungry as well. Or, your arm is hurting you from when you hit it somewhere the other day. Those are things that as a teacher, I won't be able to see because those are your internal sensations. Okay, but I can see, for example, that you are aware and that you're alert in my class because I see you jotting down notes. Okay, so that's, sometimes I can observe your consciousness, but sometimes I can't. We're going to talk about how consciousness is not always reliably, it's not always something we can reliably observe, okay? And we'll talk about this when we talk about consciousness as a psychological construct. So the main definition you need to know is that consciousness is our awareness of objects and events in our external world, as well as our internal sensations, thoughts, and feelings. So if you stop here, it should be okay. You don't really need to know the last line there, but again, that's just giving you more information. Okay, so that's what consciousness is about. Okay, it's not just an external thing, it's also everything you're thinking at any moment. That's your consciousness. Okay, so that's basically the definition that you need to know. And there are a few characteristics or things that pop out of that definition. The first one is that consciousness is personal. Okay, everyone's conscious experience or consciousness is different to them. Okay, because obviously depending on your views, how you'd make judgments of something, your experiences, even something as simple as whether you had breakfast or not, okay, will cause different changes in consciousness. If you come to class and you haven't had breakfast in the morning, you might be feeling more internal sensations of hunger, that you feel like, oh, I really need to, eat something, like you feel really hungry, compared to someone who's had breakfast and come to class, because their experience was different from yours in the morning. They actually had the breakfast and came to class, whereas you didn't. Subjective. So our consciousness is, different from person to person. Okay. And it's different again because of the fact that we each have different personal experiences and we each make different personal judgments. Okay. Another example is if you have a phobia of spiders, or you have a very negative judgment of spiders and negative perception of what spiders are, you might be very affected and very focused on a spider that's next to your desk. And that might actually distract you from your learning compared to someone who doesn't really care much about spiders or who doesn't think they're as scary. So again, different people have different experiences of consciousness there. Continuous. So our consciousness is continuous because our consciousness doesn't ever become empty. It doesn't ever go away. It doesn't ever stop. Okay. And we call this, actually, it's called the stream of consciousness. Stream meaning like a lake or a river that just keeps flowing. Okay. From the minute we wake up to the minute we fall asleep, and even while we're asleep, we experience different conscious experiences. Okay, some of them are unconscious as well, but we experience things like dreams and nightmares, and those things don't just come out of nowhere. They're all related to our consciousness, okay, at the end of the day. And our consciousness is lastly changing. So we're never in the same state of consciousness for a very, very long period of time. For example, when you come to school and your teacher's teaching you something, you might be paying a lot of attention, but then you start daydreaming halfway through the lesson. And daydreaming is actually a separate state of consciousness. Okay, when you get home and you're tired, you might have a little nap, you fall asleep. That's a separate state of consciousness. So we're constantly shifting and moving and fluctuating in terms of the states of consciousness that we're going through. So those are the 4 characteristics of consciousness that you guys need to know. Okay, it's very important to know what each of those mean, as well as kind of linking them back to the definition that we looked at on the previous slide. Okay, so that's basically the characteristics. So now we're looking at what does consciousness mean as a psychological construct. Now, psychological construct sounds like very confusing. Like what does that mean? It sounds very technical, but actually a psychological construct is just a term given to any issue or any experience or anything that we know 100% exists, but we can't directly observe that thing happening. Okay. Before looking at consciousness, we'll look at other examples, okay, of psychological constructs. Happiness, okay? A person might smile when they're in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're happy. We know that happiness exists, but we can't directly observe or say with 100% certainty that this person is happy, because maybe they show their happiness on the outside, but on the inside, they're feeling something else, okay? The same thing with love. Okay, love, we know 100% sure we know that love exists. We know that it's a thing. We know that it's something we see all around the world, but we can't directly observe love. Okay, there's not like you know, a wavelength of the brain that shows that someone's in love. Okay, yeah, we can judge a person's neurotransmitter levels and how much dopamine gets released, but you know, dopamine gets released when we eat chocolate. That doesn't mean that we're in love unless we're in love with the chocolate. Okay, so love itself, human love, is different. Okay, we know that it exists, but we can't directly observe that concept. Similarly, consciousness is something that we know exists. Okay, we know that people can go from a state of being unconscious to being conscious. We know that they can go from a state of being, you know, conscious, like listening in class, to daydreaming, which is a state of altered state of consciousness. Okay, so essentially, consciousness is something we know exists, but we can't directly observe or measure that particular concept with 100% certainty. Okay, we can get close to measuring it, but there are many factors that can influence whether someone is conscious or not. Okay, so in this photo, that kind of demonstrates that concept. So a person might appear from the outside to be focused. Like all these kids look like they're focused. Okay, some of them look a little bit more focused than others. Some of them, it's pretty obvious that they're daydreaming. But, you know, they might look like they're focused, and the teacher might continue to keep explaining stuff, but actually a lot of them are just daydreaming, you know, thinking about a car, or thinking about cats, or thinking about being home playing video games. All right, so it is difficult to judge with certainty what state of consciousness a person is in just by looking at or observing them from the outside. But again, like I said, we can try to measure those changes. And in 8C spread, we're going to be looking at some of the machines or technology or equipment that we can use to try to make a judgment or try to estimate the changes in consciousness that a person goes through. Okay, and we can do this by looking at changes in brainwave activity and all that kind of stuff. All right, so that is basically consciousness as a psychological construct. Okay, so that is that. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and now we've got states of consciousness on a continuum. So now we talked about states of consciousness and how a person can go through different conscious experiences. Specifically, we looked at daydreaming and we looked at focus attention, which are things that usually students show every day when they come to school. There are also other states of consciousness, okay? And if you look on the left-hand side, hold on, let me get my text. Okay, if we start on the left-hand side, these states of consciousness, probably up to here, kind of show a lack of awareness. Okay, so kind of everything towards the left-hand side of that continuum show a lack of awareness, okay? With the extreme lack of awareness being on the extreme end of that left-hand side, which is coma. When someone's in a coma, they have an extreme lack of awareness, okay? People might be talking to them. You've seen in those movies when someone's in a coma and, you know, their loved one comes up to them and starts like, you know, admitting all these secrets and admitting all these feelings that they had for them or whatever. Okay, and then that person's in a coma, so obviously they can't hear or make sense of what that person's saying because they've got that complete lack of awareness. Okay, when we look at the right-hand side, especially the most extreme right-hand side, these kind of show high awareness. Okay, focused attention is the most awareness that a person can show. Focused attention is not just the attention you're showing in class when you're listening to me, like explaining a PowerPoint or something, but it's like, for example, if I gave you a practice exam question to do, or you were in a SAC situation and there was a really difficult question in there where you had to look at multiple parts of a scenario, or you're solving a maths worded problem in an exam, which requires you to, deal with multiple equations at one time. Okay, that's focused attention when you're dealing with a lot of different stimuli at one time, and it requires your full attention and your full focus and full mental effort there. Normal waking state is different from focused attention, because in a normal waking state, it's like you're just alert and you're aware of your environment, but you're not like putting your full activity into it. Okay, you're not a full active participant there. So normal waking state could be you listening to me explaining the PowerPoint in class and just taking down notes. It's not like a full mental effort required there. Daydreaming, we know, is when you shift from a normal waking or focused attention state to a state of thinking about something else. So you're no longer focusing on the task, but you're focusing on other thoughts. Okay. And meditation is when you are focusing on one specific stimuli while kind of ignoring everything else. So you focus on like a chant, like or like you focus on a picture, or you focus on your breath. That's meditative state or meditation. Hypnotized is kind of similar. You focus on one stimuli and you block out everything else, and apparently you're supposed to get like, in the movies, like hypnotized, where that thing happens to your eyes and then it's like, okay, you are now feeling very sleepy. Hypnotism is an actual thing. People use it to overcome addictions and overcome like bad habits. But again, like, it is a state of consciousness, because you're going from a normal waking state where you are aware of everything happening around you to a state where you're not as aware, or you're just focusing on one specific thing. Okay. And yeah, those are the different states of consciousness. So we all know what each of these are. Okay. You just need to know that, these are the altered states, and the normal waking states are just these two. Okay. So that's normal waking consciousness, and the rest of them are kind of altered states of consciousness. Okay, we'll learn about what those terms mean anyway on the next slide. So before we look at what the definitions of normal waking and altered states of consciousness are, we need to understand, why do we need that continuum? Number one, the continuum shows us that our experiences change throughout the day, and that throughout the day we can experience more than just one state of consciousness. And we always do, right? Like, we always wake up in the morning from sleep, and then we, become aware of our environment. We realize, oh my God, it's already 7 o'clock, got to get ready for school. That's normal waking state. If we have a SAC first period at school, we go into focused attention. We're focusing on the questions, okay? The SAC means the marks, and the marks go towards your score. So you are putting your full mental effort there. Period 3 and 4, you don't have a SAC anymore. So it's time to go back to class and learn new content. You might again go back into a normal waking state, but then halfway through the class, it gets boring and you start to daydream. Okay, what am I going to wear for graduation? Is the graduation going to happen? What am I going to do after lockdown's over? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's basically showing you that throughout the day, we go through different states of consciousness. Okay, and that is, again, one of the reasons why we need that continuum. We're never in a static state of consciousness. We're always changing between states of consciousness. This third point here, because it helps, the continuum helps us to distinguish between states of consciousness that occur naturally by themselves, for example, sleep, as well as states of consciousness that are induced. Induced means you have to bring them on. For example, we all naturally fall asleep at some point. We don't really need to hook ourselves to a machine to fall asleep. It just happens naturally. Whereas for anesthetic, we can't just go home and be like, okay, I'm just going to go under anesthetic now. Like, that's something that we have to bring that on through the proper equipment, through the proper, inhalation of the substance and whatever. Okay. So that basically means that's induced because you bring it on. Naturally occurring means it just naturally happens. Okay. So that's the difference. We'll learn more about those in a few slides. So the differences between normal waking consciousness and altered state of consciousness is that normal waking consciousness, like I said before, is just it's just your normal state of being alert, being awake, being aware of everything in your external environment, as well as your internal environment, like your feelings, your thoughts, your experiences. So this definition, guys, is literally the same as the definition of consciousness, the first slide that we went through. You don't have to memorize this as a separate definition, because they are essentially the same definition. Okay. So the same as the general definition for consciousness. Altered state of consciousness is a bit different. So altered state of consciousness is a state of consciousness that is distinctly different from normal waking consciousness in terms of some of these characteristics. And we'll look at these characteristics in the next spread. It's really common sense, but they're just the names we give to these characteristics there. Yes, when we get back to school, I will be giving out a hard copy of the PowerPoint. Yeah, I had already printed it out, which sucks, but we're not at school today. So yeah, inshallah, when we get back, you will get the hard copy. Okay, so then we talk about, yeah, just like I said in the previous slide, there are some naturally occurring states of consciousness, okay, that are altered states and induced altered states. So naturally occurring altered states of consciousness are sleep, dreaming. Okay, we can't control when dreaming happens. It just happens itself. Daydreaming also happens itself. Even though you might be like, no, I control when I start daydreaming. Actually, a lot of the time it happens by itself. People are more likely to daydream when they're bored or when they're like doing an activity that's monotonous or quite where they're like a passive recipient, like you sitting on the bus getting home or sitting on the train getting to a place where you're not actively doing something, you're more likely to daydreaming in those situations, as well as getting drowsy. So if you're working on a task for a long time and you're starting to get like, oh, like I can't be bothered, I don't want to do it anymore, and you start to feel a bit drowsy, that's a naturally occurring way of your body responding to that activity, okay? And that's a naturally occurring altered state of consciousness, okay? So naturally occurring altered states of consciousness, as I said, they happen themselves naturally. You don't have to bring it on. It happens without intervention or intention. Okay, there's no plan for those to happen. Induced altered states of consciousness, when you induce something, you bring it on. Okay, so induced altered states of consciousness occur to some action that's taken on the individual's behalf. So these happen with intervention and with intention. There's some planning that has to occur. I can't just think that meditation is going to happen naturally. It doesn't. Okay, I have to download an app or I have to put on one of those YouTube videos and listen to the thing of, okay, the lady saying, okay, please focus on your breath. Okay, get rid of all other distractions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's meditation. Induced coma. Okay, you have to be, in some comas happen naturally, like once someone has been knocked out, but induced comas are when you are actually put into a coma. Okay, that is different from a naturally occurring one. Hypnosis. Hypnosis is obviously some stimulus you have to focus on, like a pendulum being swung in front of your face. Okay, that is basically what hypnosis is. So that's brought on. It doesn't happen naturally. As well as the alcohol and drug-induced ASC. So you take drugs, you get high, you're tripping. Okay, that is drug-induced ASC. Alcohol-induced ASC is when you're drunk, you know, you're like falling everywhere. Okay, that's because you drank alcohol, you brought it on. Okay, that's induced. So you should know what are some common examples of naturally occurring and induced altered states of consciousness. Okay, so that's basically that. Okay, so the next spread looks at features of states of consciousness, and this one is pretty straightforward, but you just need to know what the names are. That's the main thing. So when we're looking at features of states of consciousness, this is basically the kind of stuff that happens, okay, the characteristics or the features that we see occurring as a person moves from a state of normal waking consciousness, where they are alert or aware of their environment, as well as everything happening inside themselves, to a state of an altered state of consciousness, okay? As they go from this to this is the stuff that we see happening, okay? Or the changes that we see occurring as they move from the normal waking conscious state to the altered state of consciousness. Now, your book gives you a nice memory tip for learning these, which is accepts. So A for levels of awareness, C for content limitations, C for controlled and automatic processes, E for emotional awareness, P for perceptual and cognitive distortions, T for the time orientation, and S for self-control. So just use that memory tip to help you remember what they are. And you need to know the names of these properly, as well as what they are, because in a scenario, if we ask you to outline one change in psychological state, you need to be able to use the name. You need to be able to say, okay, maybe Tom experienced changes in his self-control. So you get 1 mark for naming, and then you have to explain that, and you get separate marks for explaining. So you need to learn the names of these properly. These are keywords. Okay, so just going through each one. The first one is level of awareness. And the really important point to bring home from this slide is that your awareness is influenced by your attention. Okay, each one has the letter A in it. So you need to remember awareness is influenced by attention, and that there are 3 types of attention that we look at. Okay, you've got selective attention and you've got divided attention. Now, you might have heard of these terms before. Selective attention is when we're doing, when we're doing something and we're just focusing all of our mental effort onto one specific thing and blocking out all the others, or excluding all the other things that might be around us. So if you're talking to someone, but then you hear your conversation, you hear your name in someone's conversation close by, you might kind of stop listening to the person who's talking to you and kind of tune into the other conversation where your name was mentioned. That's called selective attention. Divided attention is more used when we're doing things like multitasking. Okay, when we're doing things where we don't need to put our full attention into one specific thing. So you can see in this picture, this dad is holding his baby, he's reading his email, he's ironing. Okay, he's doing multiple things there. All of these things like ironing, reading emails, holding his baby are probably things that he does every day. So none of these tasks require selective attention on his part. Okay, so that's why he's able to use divided attention to do those tasks. Okay, and we call these, and we'll learn about these, we call these tasks that use automatic processing. Okay, because he's done them every day, he's so familiar with them that they're so easy for him to do that he can actually use divided attention and multitask while he's doing them. Whereas if I was to give you a maths problem that you've never encountered before, you have to put your full mental effort to do that maths problem. Yeah. So you would require selective attention to do that. Okay, it's something hard. It's not something you've done before that you do every day. So you do need to focus your full attention into doing that. So that is basically what your selective attention is about. Okay, so selective attention, you can only do one task at a time, and that one task itself is difficult, and we say that one task will require controlled processing. We'll talk more about controlled and automatic processing in the next few slides. With divided attention, though, the tasks themselves are easy, so you can multitask, you can do multiple tasks at one specific time, and for that reason, those tasks require divided attention. Okay, you can divide your attention across multiple tasks there. So our levels of awareness are influenced by our attention. Essentially, the lower the level of consciousness you have, so if you go from, for example, being alert and aware in class to daydreaming, your daydreaming is going to influence your level of awareness. Okay, usually in the movies and stuff you see, or even in real life, you see like if someone's daydreaming and a teacher's like, okay, Thomas, answer this question for me, and the kid's like thrown off course, he's like, oh, like what do I do now? Okay, that's because he was putting all his attention into his daydream rather than paying attention to what was happening outside of his daydream in the actual classroom. So our level of awareness, as our attention goes down, so too does our level of awareness. That's the general pattern that we see there. So I just talked about now controlled processes and automatic processes. Now, in general, what is processing about? The levels of processing that we use basically refer to how much attention or focus we put into a particular task, or how much attention or focus we put to understand something. Okay, if you remember when we were doing unit 3 and we were learning about like classical conditioning, I remember it took a lot of us time, more focus, more concentration to understand classical conditioning like UCS, CS, NS, all that stuff, compared to observational learning. Observational learning in comparison was a much simpler learning theory for us to understand. So we could say that for a lot of us, we had to put a lot of controlled processes into understanding the topic of classical conditioning, whereas understanding the topic of observational learning was more of an automatic process. It didn't require as much mental effort, attention, or cognitive processing. So like I just said on the previous slide, controlled processes are associated with tasks that are hard for you to do, or that are difficult for you to do, or even just tasks that you're not familiar with because you haven't done them before. So solving some maths problem, driving. Okay, the first time you get your L's and you're driving, you're kind of focusing on everything. You're like, okay, oh, did I put the handbrake up? Did I do this? Is my foot on the brake or the accelerator? Like, what am I doing? You're constantly second guessing yourself. And that's because at the start, when you're driving and you're on your L's, it is a controlled process for you because you've not done it before. Okay. Over time though, after you get your full license, after you get your red P's, green P's, whatever, you realize that you're not thinking as much when you're driving. You can turn on the radio or sync your Bluetooth up to your car and, put on your music or whatever, and you can drive at the same time as doing that. Some people, obviously it's not the right thing to do, but some people even, wear makeup while driving their car, or they can eat while driving their car, or they can talk on the phone, or, answer their hands-free while driving their car. So that shows you that for those older people who've already been driving for many, many years, driving actually went from being a controlled process when they first had their ALS to actually being an automatic process. It got easier with time. Okay. Another example of an automatic process is anything that is generally quite easy for you to do. Okay, so for you guys, for example, most of you are really good with texting, okay, on your phone. So most of you would be able to, like, if your mom's asking you a question, you might be able to answer her question and still continue texting without missing a beat. Okay, that shows you that texting is an automatic process for you because you're able to do it alongside with other tasks, and you're able to use divided attention. In that case, you're able to multitask while texting. Okay, so that's basically an automatic process. So the name itself, automatic, suggests that it's so easy for you, it's automatic, it's so familiar to you. And for that reason, it doesn't require a lot of effort or a lot of cognitive processing. Cognitive processing means like high levels of thinking and reasoning and that kind of stuff. Okay, now what's the difference? Now in normal waking consciousness, which is like when you're normally just up and you're awake and you're alert, okay, people can usually perform both. They can usually multitask using divided attention, and they can usually focus on a specific thing if they have to. However, if they're in an altered state of consciousness, for example, if they're drunk, if they're in an alcohol-induced, if they're under the influence of drugs, if they're daydreaming, if they're drowsy, there's going to be a lower ability to perform controlled and automatic processes. And this is particularly the case for multitasking. When you're in an altered state of consciousness, you're not able to multitask as well. So that same guy that we saw in the previous slide, if I can go back, the one who was doing all these things, reading his email, ironing, holding his baby, he might not be able to do all those tasks if he was under the influence of drugs, or if he had just had, I don't know, a can of beer or something a few minutes prior. Okay, so basically, when you're in an altered state of consciousness, you have a lower ability to perform those tasks, okay, particularly tasks that use divided attention. Okay, you might be thinking, that's weird. Wouldn't people actually, struggle more to, use selective attention? Well, yeah, they do, but there are conditions to this as well. And you realize when we look at another study called the Dawson and Reed study, that when people are drowsy, for example, not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, forget that stuff. When a person is sleep deprived and they come and they've got, been given a hard question to do, because it's actually exercising their brain more and it's engaging them more, they're actually more likely to put in extra effort to solve that question compared to something that's easier and that doesn't stimulate their brain. Okay, we'll talk more about this when we get to that topic. But yeah, that's levels of processing. So controlled processes are processes that require a lot of mental effort, attention, and cognitive processing. Automatic processes are used for tasks or functions that require lower levels of mental effort, lower levels of attention, and lower levels of cognitive processing there. Okay, so the next thing is content limitations. As you move from a normal waking conscious state to an altered state of consciousness, what we see is that there are limitations. What's that? Turn that off. Okay, so what we see is when we've got content limitations basically means like restrictions, yeah? So content limitations means that there are restrictions on content with reference to what altered state of consciousness we are going through. So basically, like when we are in a state of like being awake and being alert, we are less likely to experience, weird content coming into our head. Weird content means like, when you have dreams or nightmares, sometimes you dream up things and you're like, what the hell, where did that come from? Like, that's the weirdest scenario. Like, I've never even talked to that person. Like, why did they come up in my dream? That's so weird. Okay. Generally, that's because when we're in an altered state of consciousness, like when we're asleep, we are less likely to be able to control content. There are limitations, or there are restrictions on what kind of content we can control. Okay, because we can't. When we're dreaming, we're not in a state of consciousness where we can be like, okay, I need to stop this, like stop dreaming about this, dream about something else. Okay, so content limitations is the extent to which a person can control the type of information as well as the amount of information that they pay attention to. So in normal waking consciousness, our content is more controlled. Okay, whereas in altered state of consciousness, there are less limitations. This also like applies to things like suppression. Okay, suppression is when you've gone through something traumatic and you're able to, during your normal waking state of consciousness, you're able to control that from affecting you. So if someone's been like raped, or they've been abused, or they've been abducted and they were, you know, tortured for so many years or whatever, like those kind of traumatic experiences, those people can eventually learn to try to live a normal life, okay, by consciously blocking out those thoughts when they're awake, okay, when they go to work or when they go to school. But if once they fall asleep, they can't control those thoughts coming back into their head. They can't control those traumatic memories from not coming into their dreams or their nightmares. So for that reason, you know that obviously in normal waking consciousness, we have more control over the kind of content that we that comes into our awareness, whereas in an altered state, we have less control. Okay, that's all you really need to know. And just an example. Perceptual distortions. So perceptual distortions. So if you look at this GIF here of Oprah walking on hot coals. So this was basically when she, as a part of her show, she went to some retreat. It was like a place where she learned like self-control, and she learned to, like, you know, control her thoughts and her feelings. And so after a seminar of knowing how to control her feelings, knowing how to control things like pain. This is a really popular, used to be popular, probably not now, but it used to be a popular thing to show that, you know, people can actually, you know, do things like sit on a bed of nails or walk on hot coals if they can train their brain and train their perceptions and senses to actually do that. Okay, so perceptual distortions refers to our senses. That's the first thing you need to know. Perception is about senses. Okay, last year when we did unit 2 and we learned about sensation and perception, perception is about what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch. Okay, so perceptual distortions is when something doesn't occur the way that it should. Okay, it's like when your senses get warped. So in other words, perceptual distortions are about the degree of awareness and basically how we feel things like pain, how we judge things we see or hear or smell, okay? And it's always related to sensory information, okay? And perceptual distortions are basically changes or inaccuracies or imbalances in terms of how we make judgments of those senses. So to make it really simple, in a normal waking conscious state, like if you're at school and you're just paying attention in class to what I'm saying, if a person pinches you, you would feel pain, right? Like you would obviously feel pain and you'd be like, ouch, why did you do that? Whereas in an altered state of consciousness, like if you're asleep and someone pinches you, or they brush their hand over your hair or something like that, you won't feel it, because when we're asleep, we are less likely to hear things, okay? We're less likely to see things because our eyes are closed as well, okay? We're less likely to make judgments of these things because our brains are operating on a different wavelength. We actually have different changes in brainwave activity when we're asleep compared to when we're awake. Similarly, on the other hand, like people who are under the influence of drugs, okay, you've seen there's in a lot of movies or popular cultural shows, we know that when someone is under the influence of drugs, that they see bright colors, that they hear things that are not there, okay, that they taste weird things in their mouth, okay? So that's basically what a perceptual distortion is. It's the fact that when we're in a state of consciousness that's different from normal waking consciousness, it can actually lead to distortions, okay? Distortions in our perception there. Cognitive distortions are similar. They're imbalances, or they're different ways in which we experience cognition, okay? In a normal waking consciousness, you guys can basically use your memory properly. You can think clearly. You can reason properly. You know, you can problem solve. You can make decisions in a good way. Whereas in an altered state of consciousness, you will experience disruptions or interruptions or distortions to your ability to actually efficiently remember information, store information, or even your ability to reason and make proper decisions. Okay, all of these things get influenced by an altered state of consciousness. So to give you some examples, when you're drowsy or when you're daydreaming, you're less likely to have paid attention to what the teacher was saying in class. So if the teacher calls you out and says, okay, can you give me the answer to this question we just discussed? You won't be able to do it because you were in an altered state of consciousness. You were daydreaming or you were drowsy, okay? In a normal waking consciousness, no, if you were focusing in class and you were listening and you were paying attention, you would be able to answer that question, okay? Another example is that if you were under the influence of alcohol, like you were drunk, or you were under the influence of drugs, you might not be able to remember something that someone said to you, okay? Or you might do something that shows poor decision making, okay? So all of these things are examples of how our cognition, our brain's ability to think and problem solve and use judgment properly actually gets affected or distorted when we are in an altered state of consciousness compared to normal waking consciousness. Okay, so just learn like 2 examples for how cognitive distortions occur and 2 examples for how perceptual distortions can occur. Usually for these guys, you'll get anyway scenarios and you'll have to just interpret the scenario. Okay, emotional awareness. So this one is really, again, a lot of these you see in movies and stuff as well. And that's why I keep referring back to, like, you might have seen this in a TV show or a movie. Think about someone who's drunk in a movie and the fact that, okay, now they want to go back and they want to text their ex, or they want to, they read a text that their ex had sent to them ages ago and they start crying, okay? Or a person who's normally quite shy, once they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they become very, very hyperactive, very, very unable to control their anger, okay? They have less hold or control over their emotions now. So emotional awareness is just what the name suggests. It's how conscious or aware we are about our emotions, especially the ways in which we express those emotions and control those emotions, okay? A person who's happy in a normal waking consciousness, but might smile or might appear happy, but if that same person is happy while drunk or under the influence of alcohol, they might show their happiness in a much more heightened way. Okay, heightened way means they might jump up on a table and start dancing. Okay, whereas they wouldn't show their happiness in that same way if they were in a normal waking state. So the same thing, you know, a person who's daydreaming might show less emotion compared to someone who's actually in a normal waking state of consciousness. So emotional awareness is just our emotions and how aware we are about how we express them, as well as how we control them. Okay. And depending on which state of consciousness we're in, we might express our emotions a little bit differently, okay? Either more exaggerated than normal or less exaggerated than normal. Self-control. So self-control is really important to remember that self-control is about behavior, okay? It's about physical behavior or physical action. A lot of people confuse self-control with emotional self-control. That's not it. Emotional self-control is not under this topic of self-control. It's under emotional awareness. So don't get the 2 mixed up. Self-control is about your physical behavior, like in those movies where, you know, the police officer pulls over the guy who he thinks is driving while drunk. And then he says, okay, can you walk on a straight line for me? And the police officer will judge that if this guy cannot walk on this straight line, then he's probably under the influence of some alcohol or drug, and then he might arrest him. Okay, when we're asleep, why is it that we start off in a very civilized sleep position, but then by the end of it, like our heads where our feet used to be, and it's like, why do we move so much? Because we don't have a lot of control over our physical behavior when we're asleep. We can't stop ourselves from doing that. Okay, and again, this is also another reason why some people sleepwalk or have very erratic movements during sleep, where they might, you know, kick the person that's sleeping next to them or something like that. Okay, in The Simpsons, Barney is like in a permanent state of alcohol-induced altered state of consciousness. So he's always drunk, and you know, he's always quite. There was this episode where someone was talking to him and he just punched him out. Okay, he didn't have that control over his behavior at that point in time. Okay, so self-control is about your ability to control your physical behaviors, okay? And it's also to do with controlling your coordination. So not just the fact that I'm able to control punching someone, but also am I able to walk in a straight line, okay? In a lot of movies and in real life as well, people who are drunk or under the influence of drugs, you might see that they can't even hold themselves up. They can't even walk in a balanced way. They're always kind of almost about to trip over something or bump into something. So that's what self-control is about. It's about your physical behavior, your movements, and your coordination, and to what extent you can control that in a balanced and coordinated way. Okay, so that is basically self-control. Just remember, guys, self-control is about physical behavior. It's not about controlling your emotions, okay? If you're going to talk about controlling your emotions in your answer, you have to link it back to the heading of emotional awareness. Okay, and the last one that we're looking at for today before we finish up is time orientation. Okay, this is, I think all of us have experienced this at some point. You come home after school, you try to take a 20-minute nap, and then you wake up and it's like 8 p.m. and you're like, what? That felt like 20 minutes, but how did the time go so quick? And that's because of this idea called time orientation. Orientation means position. Yeah, like the orientation of a compass, for example. So time orientation is how you feel like you're positioned at any point in time with reference to your state of consciousness. Okay, so position means how you feel like time is passing. Okay, do you feel like time is passing very quickly? Perceive means judge. Do you feel like time is passing very quickly? Do you feel like time is passing slowly? Okay, sometimes you'll be doing a task, or you'll be in class and you start daydreaming, and you feel like you've been daydreaming for 30 minutes, but then you're like, look at the clock and it's like, oh my God, that was just 5 minutes. Like, when is this class going to end? So our altered states of consciousness do influence our ability to judge time. And there's no right or wrong answer here. We can't say that, oh, in every altered state of consciousness example, a person will experience time as speeding up. That's not true, because when you're in an alcohol-induced altered state of consciousness, you might think that time is slowing down. Okay, whereas when you're in sleep, or when you're asleep, you might actually feel like time is speeding up. Okay, so again, there's no right or wrong or one answer fits all for when we're comparing normal waking with altered state. Okay, just be able to understand that when you're in an altered state of consciousness, your sense of time is distorted. Okay, it's different from normal. That's what distorted means. It's different from normal, or it's not consistent with what is normal. Okay, different from normal. So that's basically what time orientation is. In a scenario, if it shows that, oh, this girl couldn't believe that only 5 minutes had passed after her daydream, felt like longer, and then it says, okay, identify the change in psychological state that has occurred for her to feel this way, you need to say time orientation. That's how you need to name that particular characteristic. And remember, we're really strict with these words because these are keywords. You need to name them as they are. You can't use your own words or paraphrase this into something else. It has to be as this is. This is taken from your study design, these words. Okay, so they need to be written exactly as they are. Okay, that's it, guys. So this last slide here is just a summary table from your textbook. Again, just as a quick summary, just to look through it if you're in a rush. But yeah, that's it for today. This is a practice question. I'm not going to go through it today, but basically it's just, oh, you know what? We actually have a few more minutes. Maybe what we can do is just thinking, actually, no, we haven't. Just thinking. Okay, what we'll do, we will do it, guys. So what we'll do, even if you just jot down a few dot points, you don't have to write a full 4-mark answer there. Even if you can name one, just jot down a dot point. I'll read the question. So Tina was involved in a car accident after having a few drinks at a party. Her blood alcohol concentration level was well above the legal limit when the police breath tested her. So she's obviously in an alcohol-induced altered state of consciousness. In terms of 2 different perceptual distortions, explain why it would have been dangerous for Tina to drive while in this alcohol-induced altered state. So perceptual distortions are to do with our senses, remember? So think about two senses that might be differently judged or differently perceived by Tina now that she's under the influence of alcohol, and then explain how that would have been dangerous for her as she was driving. Okay, so just jot down. I'm going to give you guys like maybe 2-3 minutes to just jot down 1 or 2 ideas, and then I'll show you the sample answer there. And we've got a question. What does vegetative state mean? Vegetative state basically means that you're in a state, it's similar to being in a coma, except the best way to explain it would probably be that, you're like, your brain is a little bit more, I wouldn't say dead, but a little bit more dysfunctional. Like Normally in a coma, a person's brain is already affected, but a vegetative state is like probably one lower than a coma. Okay, so generally these kind of people show no awareness at all. Yeah, so no awareness at all. Almost like brain dead. Yeah. We don't really cover vegetative state specifically, but it is an example of a state of like no consciousness. It's like one level away from being dead, basically. Yeah. Okay, nice. So I'm getting some answers here in the chat box. Yep, so sight because alcohol makes you feel dizzy, which makes your eyesight blurry. Excellent. Yeah, that's a good answer. So you've linked it to a specific sense. Yep. And then you've explained that her eyesight might be blurry. Yeah, you could even say that this could lead to her not seeing hazards on the road. Like if someone steps onto the road, she might not see that. That might increase her chance of crashing. Yep, that's good. Another answer, sight, since she is not fully aware of her surroundings, since she's intoxicated. So if a person accidentally, yeah, excellent. Yep, that's what I just said. Good work. So yeah, all you got to do with this answer, guys, is just link it to a sense like sight, hearing, sound, whatever, and then explain how it would have been dangerous, because that's the key word there. Why is it dangerous for Tina to drive while in that state? So I'll give you guys another minute and then I'll show you the answer. And if you've already written your answer, just put it in the chat box and I'm happy to look at it now. Okay, so before I show you guys the answer, I'm just going to specify that you really need to be careful when you read the question as well. Okay, in the question, if it says perceptual distortions, you don't need to talk about cognitive distortions here. Okay, you only need to talk about perceptual distortions like issues with her sight, sound, taste, touch, hearing, that kind of stuff. If it said, rather than perceptual, if it said cognitive distortions, this is where you would need to talk about things like reaction time. This is where you would have to talk about things like her ability to make decisions, like the fact that, oh, there's a red light coming up, I got to slow down the car. Okay, you need to talk about, that's where you would need to talk about her thinking processes. Okay, if it said cognitive distortions. This question, however, doesn't say cognitive distortions, it says perceptual distortions. So that's why we need to focus on the perceptions. Okay, yep.
You know her reflexes, would it go under perceptual or cognitive?
Reflexes would be cognitive, yeah. Because reflexes isn't really a sense, but it's more of a function that is influenced by the brain and spinal cord. So it would go under cognitive. Yeah, because reflexes, rather than saying reflexes, I'd say you could probably call it her reaction time as well, because that's more of a cognitive link there. Yeah, so what I'll do, guys, is I'll just project up the answer now. Okay, this is just a sample answer. And you could have written it differently, but still get the same mark. So it just says, in her alcohol-induced state, Tina may have been less able to judge or perceive sights, okay, like visual related things, such as hazards on the road or the distance from her car to another. This may have been dangerous because her ability to see hazards and react may have been decreased because she was intoxicated. Also, Tina's ability to process sounds, so auditory stimuli, may have been lowered, meaning she might not have heard other cars beeping their horns at her or the sirens from the police car that might have been signaling her to stop. Okay, so that's just a sample answer. Again, you just need to give one reason. I think these have two reasons. These answers have two reasons in them, just to show you the range of things you could talk about. Okay. You could even sight sounds. Can we link it to anything else? I think sights and sounds are the most obvious ones. So yeah, as long as you talk about it like that, then that's the correct way to do it. Yeah. Okay, guys. So before we finish off for today, are there any other questions that we have about anything we went through today? If there are, just let me know in the chat box. All good? All right. So what I'll just stop the recording here.